go.
Welcome to Ask DW on your TVs, but live streaming on YouTube as well. I'm Nicole Fröhlich, and this is the program where we want to hear from you, your questions, your comments. Today, we're talking about the assassination of Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, and what it means for the Middle East. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says Haniyeh was killed in a pre-dawn airstrike on his residence in the Iranian capital. The attack came just hours after he attended the inauguration of Iran's new president in Tehran. There has been no claim of responsibility, but Iran and Hamas both blame Israel. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei says his country has the duty to avenge Haniyeh's death as it occurred on Iranian soil. And I have two very knowledgeable guests with me in the studio to answer your questions. Shani Rosanes, DW's Middle East analyst, and Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's with the Counter-Extremism Project, an NGO working to fight the growing threat that extremist opinions and ideologies pose to the entire world, basically. Now, he has wide experience in diplomacy and intelligence and security. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. This format is based on the questions that you submit, so go on and post them in the chat on our YouTube channel. You can hop on over there if you are not already there. While we're waiting to hear from you, I want to get the conversation started with our guest. Shani, what was your initial reaction to the killing of Haniyeh?
Well, I mean, the initial response is it's spectacular just to think of, how is it technically possible even to operate with such precision? But then when you zoom out and you process this a little bit, you try to understand where is all of this heading? What is the strategy Israel is, aiming at? What is the end goal to this war? And unfortunately, I don't see how this actually helps Israel progress its long-term goals of bringing back the hostages or of, bringing down the flames in the region. This is a very, Israel has took a very daring step, and we're yet to see how it will end up unfolding in the whole region.
How about you, Hans? How did you feel about this?
Look, this is the crescendo of last couple of days, which was particularly bad for the Iranian organized proxy system that they call the axis of resistance. You had the death of Shukr in Beirut, deputy to Nasrallah. You had American forces attacking Khatib Hezbollah in Iraq, and now you have the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, really the heart of the axis of resistance. So there is, whether it was simply opportunity that in all of these cases played a role for the attack, it is certainly advertently or inadvertently a clear political message that there is an escalation, and that there is an escalation on a fairly broad front, not only against Hamas, but against this axis of resistance organized by Iran.
Mm-hmm. We'll get back to you in a second. But first, the Iranian government says a funeral for Haniyeh will be held in Tehran before his body is then taken to Qatar for burial. We want to dive into your questions, which, just to remind you, you can post in our comment section on YouTube. But let's take a closer look at who Ismail Haniyeh was.
Ismail Haniyeh greets Iran's new president in what would be one of his last meetings. Just hours after attending the president's inauguration, he and his bodyguard were killed in a strike on his residence in Tehran. At the time of his death, Haniyeh was the political face of Hamas, the militant Islamist group that carried out the October 7th terror attacks on Israel. Hamas fighters killed around 1,200 people and took more than 250 others hostage, nearly half of whom are still held in Gaza. Haniyeh had not lived in Gaza for several years, but ran Hamas from Qatar, where he lived in exile. Born near a Gaza City refugee camp, the 62-year-old was the child of Palestinian refugees from the village of Al-Jura near Ashkelon. He joined Hamas when it was founded in 1987 and was arrested and jailed by Israel during the First Intifada, the uprising against Israeli occupation. Haniyeh was exiled to Lebanon, but he returned to Gaza following the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords. He became the Palestinian Prime Minister in 2006 and continued to rise through Hamas's ranks, eventually becoming its political chief in 2017. While Hamas's Gaza leader Yahya Sinwar is believed to have been the mastermind of the October 7th attacks, Haniyeh was seen as a more moderate force in Hamas. He has lost several of his own family members in Israeli attacks on Gaza, which have killed nearly 40,000 people since then. 3 of Haniyeh's sons and 4 of his grandchildren were killed in April. At the time, Haniyeh insisted their deaths would not affect ongoing ceasefire and hostage talks. Haniyeh represented Hamas internationally and moved around the region for diplomatic meetings. He was a key player in negotiations to stop the fighting in Gaza. Some fear his killing will be a major setback in achieving peace in the region.
Israeli officials are at this point refusing to comment on Haniyeh's death. Israel is also not denying its involvement. This behavior after a high-profile killing, is that surprising?
No, it's a standard procedure of Israel. It hardly ever takes responsibility or admits any of that. But it's, you know, if you try to analyze who would have the interest to do that and the means to do that, it's really hard to find anybody else who is the immediate suspect. You know, the fingerprints of Israel are kind of all over this. We need to make, you know, also point out, Haniyeh was on Israel's target list for a long time, definitely after October 7th. I mean, we know he's not the big mastermind orchestrating the October 7th terror attacks, but at the same time, he's also known to be the branch, you know, the part, you know, in his role in Hamas, he was the closest to Iran, bringing money, bringing, you know, support, and also sometimes when it comes to, you know, technology, you know, the kind of connections that Iran holds with as what we call proxies is of a convoluted, it's not a direct, you know, hierarchy there. But then at the same time, he was quite pivotal in that axis, you know, the connections with Iran and what it meant. So what we can learn from his, you know, his behavior in, you know, in choosing to go to a very well-publicized event, well planned ahead, the inauguration of the new presidential, you know, president in Iran, showing how safe he felt in Iran, how protected he felt there, and how maybe Iranians themselves too felt that they were, you know, following their attack on Israel in April, felt like they've sent a message of deterrence to Israel and they can, you know, be more safe and secure. Just to show you how wide and deep this message Israel was trying to send to Iran is resonating now in Tehran.
Yeah. Hans, you mentioned the killing of Fuad Shukr in Beirut yesterday. Israel did claim responsibility there. He was a high-ranking leader of Hezbollah. Why would they claim responsibility there, but not if it turned out to actually have been them in this case? Why not here?
Well, the sad truth is that the government in Lebanon is really now a sideshow to Lebanon, the country, right? It really is a country that is thoroughly under the thumb of Hezbollah. So Israel clearly didn't feel the need to obfuscate its involvement there because it was part of that response against this attack on the Jewish village on the Golan Heights where a lot of kids were dying. And this was really the opening shot of their response. I don't think it was the last one, but it was definitely the opening shot. So they very clearly declared responsibility. There they will not declare responsibility in Iran because they've never done so in the past. And there were a couple of clear assassinations that could only have been Israel, like in 2020, an al-Qaeda leader at Pastaran Avenue, one of the key shopping streets in Iran, was killed. Then Fakhri Sadeh, one of the key scientists, was killed. They abducted some scientists and IRGC officers, Revolutionary Guard officers, and interrogated them inside Iran in the past. So Israel has a network, but it never really officially takes responsibility for any of these operations in the country.
But I want to pick up on what Hans said about the network. We need to understand the ability to execute such an operation on such short time. You know, it means you have to be very well, deeply connected with operatives on the ground inside the Iranian capital. I mean, as Hans correctly said, Israel has done several operations before, mostly targeting nuclear scientists. But, you know, to zoom in on the very room that he was in, and this was also such a surgical operation that we have seen no collateral damage. There were 2 victims. It was Haniyeh and his bodyguard. So just to show you, you know, and this is part of the message Israel is trying here to send, just to show you how well connected and deep they have infiltrated the Iranian, you know, opposition maybe, or any other forces who would like to harm the Iranian regime.
I have some user questions I want to get to, but first I want to pick up on that because it sounds like a message being sent to Iran. What about the timing? Because that happened on the day the new president was inaugurated. What do you make of it, Hans?
Look, I mean, this inauguration was an inauguration of a president, but it was also a meeting of the axis of resistance. The Houthis had sent representatives, Palestinian Islamic Jihad had sent representatives, the Iraqi militias, the Syrian militias, Haniyeh was there for Hamas, even Hezbollah had sent a representative. So it was both the inauguration of a president, but also a meeting of the axis of resistance. And at least for Haniyeh, we have confirmed that he met Pezeshkian, then he met Khamenei, and then he died. So it is really now also, we are in a situation where Iran is no longer managing these relationships very clandestinely. I do remember when I was at the embassy in Tehran in 2005 to 2011, they would never really openly admit that there was a Hamas office. Everyone in the town knew that there was a Hamas office, knew where the Hamas office was, but they would never openly speak about this. They would deny that they had a relationship with the Houthis. And now inviting these leaders, not only to the funeral of Raisi, but also the inauguration of Pezeshkian, and having them gather, is certainly Iran showing that it's no longer using this proxy network in clandestine manners, but that this is their power factor in the region, which they manipulate in whatever way they see fit.
Mm-hmm. And Israel isn't having any of it, apparently.
Correct. And also when he talks about the opportunity and the timing, Haniyeh was mostly in Qatar, which would be off limits for Israel because of its very crucial role as a mediator in the talks now, and also because of their connections to the American and so on. He's been to Istanbul, Turkey. That's a no-go. It's a NATO country. Erdogan-Israel-Turkey relations are already very fraught as it is. So what's left is actually any other place. And, I think for Israelis, the fact that it was in Tehran is sort of like almost the cherry on the top, in the sense of this isn't even an extra message they can send there, sort of killing two birds with one stone, I think, but at the same time taking much higher risk, obviously.
But luckily, because otherwise this would have been a virtual declaration of war. Airstrike is a big word, what happened here. So according to Iranian media, it is really a suicide quadcopter drone, right? Which means there was a team on the ground that had that drone, that knew how to fly that drone into what window, but it is different from an Iranian aircraft circling over Tehran and releasing a rocket. Yeah. That would have been very clearly beyond the realm of deniability. That would have been a clear declaration of war, which very clearly Israel is not interested at this point in.
There is a lot happening in the chat. I want to get to that. I know there's so much to talk about, but there are so many questions coming in the chat. Tabo is asking, we have been hearing that Hamas is the problem. So is the killing of its leader going to end the war? Shani.
Well, I think that's a very simplified assumption. Of course not. We are in a vicious cycle of violence. And I think Israel has tried in the past removing several heads of its enemies, and only to realize someone else has taken their position. No one is irreplaceable. And in that sense, it will be the same case with Haniyeh. Also, specifically in Haniyeh's case, he's the official leader of the political branch, but actually Hamas today is run mostly by Yahya Sinwar. He is in Gaza, he is in the tunnels. Him and his brother are considered to be the strong people of Hamas, actually taking most of the decisions, orchestrating the October 7th event, and so on. Not to say this guy was not important enough or was not, causing enough damage. He's on the list of, terrorists on the American, at least, for example, since 2018. He's definitely a guy who's been on the radar and very active. But then Hamas is also very much of an organization that is very much widespread. It's sort of a net kind of compound, and not so much of a clear hierarchy as you would imagine in modern, as in Western terms of clear hierarchy. So in that aspect, nothing has been changed. What happens in Gaza will keep on happening in Gaza, and any of the goals Israel has set itself for, releasing the hostages, for example, have not moved 1 inch closer. Maybe only found themselves actually retreating after today.
How do you think this will affect Hamas's political operation?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. You can't kill yourself out of this problem, right? Ironically, Haniyeh's career took off when Yassin, the founder of Hamas, was killed, famously. So obviously there will be a replacement. But I think what is really important to understand is that in the last couple of years, the external leadership still had control over the internal leadership in Gaza and the West Bank. In 2014, the external leadership actually forced the leadership in Gaza to stop a confrontation with Israel. They're no longer in that position. What has value in the confrontation with Israel from Hamas' perspective are the hostages. And whoever has the hostages under his control, and this is Sinwar, has the say of what's going on. That's why Haniyeh and the Hamas team had been agreeing to some proposals from the Americans, from the Israeli side, but always had to double-check with Sinwar. In the last couple of months, it was always Sinwar who said no. So there had been a power shift from the external leadership, who was responsible for managing the sponsors, in particular Iran, of course, but also managing the money and those who actually control the fighters, and now the most valuable assets that Hamas holds in its confrontation with Israel, the Israeli hostages.
So Carlos Simaitis asks, will this assassination affect Hamas operations in any way? What do you think?
Well, we cannot undermine the symbolic meaning of Haniyeh, who he was and what he meant. He was one of the old guards of Hamas, someone who was connected to Yassin, the founding father, the religious cleric behind Hamas. They grew up; their families came from the same village, and so he was considered to be one of those founding fathers of Hamas. And his symbolic meaning is, of course, very, very meaningful. It could be maybe somewhat of a blow when you talk about morale in that aspect, but what the Palestinians have been experiencing since October 7th is so dire. There's been so many things. I doubt it would actually have any implications on the ground, if any. We also know Sinwar and Haniyeh were not the best on best terms. Hans was talking about the tension between the leadership outside of Gaza and what's happening on the ground in Gaza. And in a way, he was kind of kicked out of the immediate circle of influence, sort of like upgraded, to a different position where he would be seen by Sinwar and his, ground troops as maybe more useful and less, getting in the way of getting what they wanna achieve. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, this is not an innocent man, right? So Hamas had a string of terror attacks prior to October 7 and October 7. And as the head of the whole organization, I have personal responsibility, whatever the organization does, including October 7. So, no one innocently died here. He may have been a little bit more moderate, as some say, than Sinwar was, but apparently he didn't have an ability to force Sinwar to make an agreement. I mean, this could have been concluded many months ago. We had several rounds where things were going close, and at least in 50% of the time, it wasn't the Israeli government who rejected the deal, it was the Hamas side. And it was in the overall majority of those cases, it was Sinwar. And Haniyeh was not willing or able to get him online. So, there was, this man had blood on his hands. Not that justifies an assassination. And one can have a very hard and critical discussion whether assassinations really are impacting terror organizations, or whether it's just time that you buy yourself to do something more significant against the organization. So it's not an innocent guy that died here, but it is also not the end of Hamas by a long shot.
Also, we need to keep in mind also on this point, if you ask Netanyahu, he believes this definitely helped Israel. He believes that only pushing stronger and harder on Hamas and showing, even though Sinwar himself was not, affected by this, he feels like closing in on Sinwar, creating chaos in the organization is eventually going to, bring more and more isolation into, the immediate circle of Sinwar, and therefore, in the end, will bring an end to the war closer.
We talk a lot about Yahya Sinwar, the man who's considered the mastermind behind the October 7th terror attacks, and we actually have a question about him. Iron Fox 6 asked in the chat, where is Sinwar?
Well, apparently no one knows, including the Israelis. I mean, there was this very curious, short-term, very heavy military operation, Khan Yunis. From the outside, one could speculate, without the Israelis having said a word about this, that this was actually an attempt to get Sinwar after they apparently killed Dave in an airstrike a couple of weeks ago. But we just don't know, and the Israelis don't say, and I'm pretty sure if they knew, they would take him out immediately.
Well, the assumption of the Israelis, Hans said, is the Israelis that he's somewhere in the southern part of the Gaza Strip between Khan Yunis and Rafah, two of the last bastions still standing, left of Hamas, still their strongholds. He's definitely underground. We know the communication means with him are very limited. There's a very small circle of people who are in direct daily contact with him. And the assumption is that wherever he is surrounded by hostages. As Hans say, this is Hamas's most valuable weapon right now, or asset right now. And he using them probably as a sort of a shield in more than just, figuratively, but also physically, literally in that way.
Dr. Jack asks, if Haniyeh didn't block October 7 in the planning stages, then he is complicit and fair game, or was he not as powerful as we think? You hinted at it. I'd like to get your opinion.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, we don't really know all the in and outs of what's happening within Hamas. It is clear that we've seen a change in the organization in the last decade or so. I mean, people like Haniyeh were kicked out. People like Sinwar took more place with their very dominant, very clear attitude that is very much a militant one. We know this operation of October 7th was under wraps and in the planning for a long time. I doubt Haniyeh was not aware of it, being planned. I don't know if he knows exactly. The assumption is that he may have not been aware of the timing, but he knew that this is the plan. And I don't think we need to tiptoe around the topic. I mean, the Hamas charter initially talked very clearly about the need to, basically kill not all Israelis only, but all Jews. That's since then been a bit, changed, and now they're talking only about, the fight of the resistance, the violent resistance for the sake of the Palestinian cause. But this is something they're all signed to and believe in. This is nothing that we need to be, they themselves see pride in that. This is their cause.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Hamas Charter, and it is not actually been replaced. There is a second document a decade later. It's called the political document, right? Political declaration. This doesn't at all anywhere indicate that it's replacing the Charter. So you have two different, statements that Hamas did: destroy Israel and kill all Jews, and then a slightly more moderate political declaration. But in the declaration, it doesn't say this is replacing our charter. It's simply a political tool which was a function of the Oslo process and necessary for them to take part in the elections in 2006, which they incidentally won. And Haniyeh was done for a very short term, even the Prime Minister of the Palestinian National Authority. They needed that document to be part of that process. But that did not indicate really an ideological revision of what Hamas wants to do. And if you ask Hamas leaders today, I think they're talking far more like the charter than that policy document.
Yeah. Kat in the chat is asking a question that many people have today. What happens to hostages in peace talks now?
Well, that's a very big question. I think if you hear the families talk today, they are very much concerned. They believe Israel's decision has put their loved one in direct, even bigger threat to their lives and their fate. If we talk about Netanyahu, he feels that more pressure is the only way to get Hamas to eventually agree to a deal and to bring, Hamas down to its knees so it can finish the war. I think you can argue here that we actually don't really know. We do know that there are 115 Israeli hostages reported still in Gaza. We know about at least 30 of them are officially proclaimed dead by the Israeli IDF, and the rest, we don't know exactly where they stand with their health, their mental being, and so on. But it is clear that every day that passes, there's not, doing them any better. That's quite
true. It is a race against time. Where are these talks left now?
Well, I mean, nothing disrupts negotiation quite as effectively as killing the chief negotiator of the other side. So obviously there is going to be a pause right now. We don't know how this is playing out with Iran. We don't know how it's playing out with Hamas and Hezbollah at this point. I cannot see a resumption next week of the talks. Clearly, Hamas has an interest to keep some of the hostages alive, because alive, as brutal as it sounds, alive hostages are more valuable than dead bodies. But that doesn't really refer to every single one they still have. So if I'm a family of a hostage, I have absolutely good cause to be extremely concerned. And there's, of course, a critical point here. I mean, how much value does the current Israeli government really set to bringing all of those hostages are still alive home. This operation really clearly puts, at least for some of them, their life in danger.
And many people in Israel, sorry to interrupt you there, they feel like this is not a priority for Netanyahu.
Oh, yeah, you
right?
see it in polls repeatedly. Many Israelis believe Netanyahu is operating based to political needs and not, prioritizing the return of the hostages. But we also need to remember why, when we talk about the deal or a ceasefire deal or the hostage deal, there's different terms to how every side sees it. If you see the Americans, and we could have seen it last week in Netanyahu's visit in D.C., they see it as the beginning of the end. They hope it will change the momentum, even though officially it's supposed to start only in 6 weeks of ceasefire. Mm-hmm. They hope it would be lead to a permanent ceasefire, and they see it as the beginning of the end. If you look at Netanyahu and his cabinet, this is the one thing he refuses adamantly to agree on or to commit to, that this would be, Israel would be committed to ending all hostilities or the fire. And also, the deal right now, as it's on the table, talks about 30 hostages. There will still be over 80 left in Gaza. So the idea that the deal, the hostage deal, ceasefire deal, whatever it is, would be the magic, solution to it all. That for itself is a false narrative. And this is partially also, we've seen Netanyahu going to the Congress, asking the Congress, I need more support, I need more weapon, I need more time, I need more political support, because I'm going further in. I'm not, scaling things down. And we've seen what Israel has been doing in the week since then. Very proactive, very much sort of doubling down on its efforts, trying to show the world, and mostly the region and its enemies in the region, that it's not deterred by anything, and it will do whatever it takes, no matter who or what's, jeopardizing the well-being of its citizens.
Hans, Joe Mama is asking, very much related to this, can Israel use this strike or these strikes, what we've seen over the past 24 hours, to galvanize support for Netanyahu, or is he due to still see the door on his way out? What do you think?
I don't think this reputation of Netanyahu inside Israel is recoverable, right? So even before October 7, we saw massive demonstrations because of what this government's political program for Israeli society and Israeli democracy is, right? So real rebuilding, strengthening the more religious aspects and weakening the more democratic aspects. So add to this the abject, incredible security failure that October 7th represents for Mr. Security, the way that Netanyahu for 2 decades have been billing himself as an Israeli politician. Add to that the really inability to control a territory that is not that large, the Gaza Strip, after 10 months. And one has to ask a question whether none of the lessons that the Americans learned in Iraq and that the international community learned in Afghanistan have been learned by the Israeli government. A couple of weeks ago, we spoke to each other about this really strange insurgency strategy where you conquer a part of the Gaza Strip and then you leave. And of course, Hamas is going to come back to that part of the Gaza Strip. So no hold, no administer, no political plan of what happens the day after that is necessary to stabilize the Strip, because in this government, there are forces like Ben Gvir and Smotrich who think about repopulating Gaza with Israeli settlers and pushing all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to Egypt. You can't bring this and a sustainable solution for Gaza in the future under one hat, as we say in Germany. It's really impossible to combine. So the option is conflict. And that's apparently what Israel, at least under Netanyahu at the moment, for the time being, is choosing.
Also, we need to keep in mind, Netanyahu, as long as he had the moderates in his cabinet, had someone who kind of holding him back, someone who was considered to be the voice of reason, trying to be more conciliatory, more appeasing to the international community, to the Americans. We know the Americans very much like the idea that Benny Gantz, the former chief of the military, was part of the Israeli unity government. He's no longer there. And now Netanyahu is completely under the grace and in the hands of those extremes, right members of his party, of his coalition. And he's going all in that aspect, that he's very much, he also is now the political situation in America is such that he is also facing an American president who does not really have much, is more of a lame duck. He doesn't really have much, ability to stop Netanyahu from his, plan. Biden has a small leverage in the sense of the ammunition, how much of it Israel gets and what exactly it gets. But eventually, and this is why Netanyahu still gets away with it, Israel still gets away with it, nobody, if you talk about the moderates in the region, if it's the Saudis and some, of the Gulf countries, if you talk about the Americans, nobody really wants to see Hamas win. Nobody wants to see Iran win. Israel's enemies are real, and they're not just Israel's enemies. In that aspect, that fact is true. And as long as Israel is fighting that fight, it's going to be very hard for America to sit out and say, no, we're not helping you in that, despite the very tense, disagreements about the way this fight needs to be handled and conducted.
Now that you mentioned countries in the region, we actually have a question about that. Alex S. asks, any sign Qatar is going to change their policy of harboring high-ranking Hamas and other group members? What do you think, Hans?
Well, Qatar has been sitting on both sides of the fence, unfortunately, for a very, very long time. Whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood leadership who is in Qatar, whether it's the Taliban who have their office in Doha, whether it's Hamas who has its headquarters and political leadership there, they are really sitting on both sides. Of course, there was immediately a statement of condemnation from the Qatari government after this killing. They are at the moment shielded from criticism from the United States because of their role as a mediator. But once this is over, I'm quite sure, and there are first signs in Congress that this is a growing issue, there's going to be a very long and hard look at the role of Qatar in the run-up to October 7, how much of an objective mediator they were, or on which side they actually happened to fall when things got tricky.
But we have to remember, the Americans are very much dependent on Qatar. They have their biggest military base in the region, in the Gulf, is in Qatar. And what the Qataris have been saying in their defense, we've heard them, they had a bit of a media blitz a couple of months ago saying, we're here under, we were invited to help Hamas. Also the money, the Qatari money that was, funneled into Gaza, into Hamas's hands. We were asked by the Americans to do that, quoting Hillary Clinton and other officials in the American administrations along the year. They ask us to pitch in, to help Gaza, to help, Hamas in order to help the population, and also in the hopes, the conception was that once we bring money into Gaza, then we will weaken terror because, the people there will have less incentive. They would want to have, more normal life and so on. So we were actually used by the Americans, and now they point fingers at us as, to blame us for what we've been doing while we were actually trying to save them and help them and the Israeli interests.
Yeah, but on the other hand, no one asked Al Jazeera to become the mouthpiece of Hamas.
They're a very sophisticated player. The Qataris are very sophisticated, and it's unbelievable that for such a small country, they have managed to really gain so much clout in the international scene and definitely in the regional scene. This is quite a masterful, diplomacy.
Yeah, as I said, they sit on both sides of the fence. I would assume if you are a major non-NATO ally of the United States, it would be hunky-dory if you could decide to sit on our side of the fence or not on the fence.
Now, kind of bringing that conflict to where we are, to Germany, AY is asking, what will be the position of Germany if a war occurs between Israel and Lebanon, referencing, of course, the attack against Fouad Shukr yesterday in Beirut, the Hezbollah leader?
Look, I mean, we have seen German intelligence officials traveling to Lebanon, trying to defuse the situation. Germany's positioning has not changed. We are at the side of Israel, obviously not at the side of Hezbollah. But understanding what a war of Israel against Hezbollah would mean not just for Hezbollah, i.e. near total destruction, including near total destruction at least of southern Lebanon, if not of all of Beirut as well, but also that a war against Hezbollah by Israel would mean a really hard to manage destruction, at least in the towns in northern Israel, because number one, the Iron Dome only protects you so far, and the capabilities and the numbers of the apparent arsenal of Hezbollah, 150,000, which was deliberately built up, by the way, by Iran after the last war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, is definitely going to overwhelm the Iron Dome. There are a couple of weapon systems that we have seen only individually used in the last couple of weeks, i.e. fast-flying, low-flying drones that the Iron Dome nor David Sling are not picking up. So there is definitely going to be destruction. So, of course, it is the interest not only of Lebanon and the Lebanese people, but also the Americans, the French, the Germans, the Saudi Arabians, who all put pressure on Hezbollah to calm things down again. Unfortunately, the trajectory has been in the opposite direction so far, and I'm not seeing a clear exit at this point.
But that's also something Israel is banking on. Israel, knows the weakness of Lebanon. He recognizes the sentiment in the international community to help Lebanon, as the failed state it is, to sort of recover. And it's quite clear that a war right now would not be what Lebanon needs. And it's also clear to Lebanese people. We hear a lot of, Israel is counting on the internal Lebanese opposition to be somewhat, a hindering effect, stopping Hezbollah from going all in, because Hezbollah has a dual role here. On the one hand, they see themselves as the protectors of Lebanon and the Lebanese pride, but then on the other hand, they're also proxies of Iran. They have their own Shiite and axis and their own goals when it comes to fighting Israel, supporting the solidarity with the Palestinians, and playing this dual game actually is now putting them in a very hard position where these two goals are very much conflicting with each other, and Israel hopes this will be chilling down some of the response that we might be seeing from Hezbollah to the Fuad Shukr assassination.
Another country positioning itself as an intermediary in this entire affair is Turkey. Marcela Carrillo Gonzalez asks, would Hezbollah be backed by Turkey in their intentions to affect Israel? Is Erdogan just bluffing? Hans, let's continue with you.
No, I think it's interesting to see. Israel and Turkey have had ups and downs, but in the last years, it's mostly downs and downs. Erdogan has become more and more, extreme about his stand when it comes to Israel. Funnily enough, it was just shortly before October 7th or 2 years ago, that he actually met with Netanyahu after a long time, and they were talking about, restarting their relationships. It's too hard for Erdogan not to join in solidarity with that cause. It helps him internally, but I also think there's a true sentiment there. Mostly, less with Hezbollah, which is a Shiite force, but mostly with Hamas and the Palestinians. Turkey and Gaza and Hamas, what they both share is that they're in their model of regime and their model of their belief in, and they both are rooted in the model that we see by the Muslim Brotherhood. That's the political, religious Muslim movement that was founded in Egypt, actually. But it was very, very influential when we're trying to understand political Islam. And it's very much what Erdogan sees himself as a goal, and he very much wants to protect. Same things go with Hamas, where all of the leaders we've seen including Haniyeh, who was just assassinated, all coming from exactly that breeding ground.
Yeah, the rhetoric of Erdogan has been really quite astonishing the last couple of days, and especially again today, where he talks about getting involved. This is, in my opinion, just rhetoric. This is different. He said, wow, we were involved in Armenia, we were involved in Libya. Yes, they were to a certain extent, but this is a totally different kettle of fish. And looking at the performance of the Turkish military against Kurdish fighters, both in Syria as well as in the north of Iraq, I think he would be well advised to stay away from any direct military confrontation with Israel. But of course, it would bring NATO in an impossible position if he, in any way, shape or form, would get involved not just rhetorically, as he is right now, but also militarily.
Another very tiny side effect of that is Azerbaijan and Armenia, you were mentioning, because when the Iranians initially today talked about a third country from which the missiles were shot, it seems to be false, but the hint is the references to Azerbaijan, who's on the northern border of Iran, and it's a pivotal ally of Israel in the region. Israel helps Azerbaijan mostly with weapons, but not only. And we know the Nagorno-Karabakh, we know the conflict there when it comes to Armenia, which, and Turkey. This is part of this whole pile that Erdogan is also not too happy about, and Israel very much needs Azerbaijan, and that's also another tiny part in this very messy region.
There is a lot of activity in the chat, so I want to try to get to a couple more questions. We only have about 5 minutes left, so let's get into it. Ellie Carouse asks, is this an opportune moment for Israel to try to finish this once and for all? And their new method is targeting leaders. Is this their thinking? What do you say, Shani?
I don't know. What is finishing it once and for all? Israelis are not going anywhere. The region is not changing. Palestinians are not going anywhere. There's going to have to be a solution. I think, we talked about it briefly before. You take out one leader, another one comes instead of him. I think eventually, expending and expending the bloodshed, it's probably not the best way to bring the peace, because we've seen too much of it in the region and it's not taking any good turns.
And I think you said before, you can't kill your way to peace, or am I paraphrasing you correctly there?
Many have tried, all have failed.
We don't have any questions in the chat right now, so if you want to get another question in, we have 4 minutes. Keep your questions coming. We'll be happy to answer them. I do want to ask how you think Iran is now actually going to respond. They say that they have a right, they have a duty to respond to this. What is that going to look like, you think?
I mean, I can give you the possibilities. I'm not sure which one Iran will go for. I think we can agree that it's not a question of if, but whether a question of how and when. First of all, we need to keep in mind this might take time. The Iranians might not immediately respond. That's one thing we've seen also in the past. It could be a sort of a joint response with Hezbollah, for example, or any other of the proxies that they have. A proxy response for itself will not do, because Hezbollah has always been involved with Israel. The Houthis have been involved with Israel for a long time. Iran would have to be directly putting itself in the line of response. It can do it outside of Israel, we're talking about Europe, maybe some, diplomatic missions or whatever. There's also the Olympic Games, the delegation there. I know there's a very high alert when it comes to Israeli officials accompanying the group in Paris, thinking about that. So that could be one option. And of course, the direct attack on Israel, if and when it happens, I think the Iranians will try to find a very symbolic, very central target, but then at the same time to avoid damage, to keep it very much contained in order to prevent escalation. Sort of being able to hint, we have responded, but we keep it, within some sort of an acceptable equation.
Yeah, Hans, is a wider regional war inevitable still?
Inadvertent escalation, besides, there is no strategic interest on Iran's side or on the Israeli side to really get into a direct confrontation. I think one thing that we've learned from this barrage of drone and rocket attacks in April was that it not only didn't work for the Iranians, it just backfired propagandistically in quite a spectacular manner. So not only did one single rocket hit, which even was a problem for the most ardent proponents of the regime in Tehran to say this was a success out of hundreds, but also most of them were shot down by Arab nations who were defending Israel. This was a complete propaganda backfire, in my opinion, for the regime. So unlikely that we see something like this. But terrorism, there is a long history. In Burgas, they killed via Hezbollah Israeli tourists. Here in Berlin in 1992, they killed Kurdish politicians in the infamous Mykonos restaurant attack. So there is a possibility of terrorism, including terrorism on European soil, that we definitely should be concerned about.
And we need to remember, April 14th, the attack that is, Iran has, that red line has been crossed. And now everything is fair game. And this is the new situation we're living in this region where Iran and Israel are in direct, possible clashes. And we will see it coming again and again because the rules have been changed and are now being renegotiated.
Shani Rosanes, our Middle East analyst, Hans-Jakob Schindler of the Counterterrorism Project. Thank you both so much for those fascinating insights. There's much more to talk about, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much. And thank you, all of our viewers who share their questions, their comments in the chat. This was a true pleasure, and you helped turn Ask DW into a platform of genuine dialogue and understanding. If you want to know more, if you want to dig deeper, you can always get the latest news and information around the clock on our website. That is dw.com. And make sure to follow us on social media if you are not already doing that. Our handle there is @DW News. Thank you so much.